On the morning of August 23, 1914, German soldiers advanced through the flat Belgian countryside near the city of Mons. They moved in dense formations, thousands of field grey uniforms marching toward the canal that cut through the coalfields south of the city. On the other side of that canal, a thin line of British soldiers waited behind whatever cover they could find. Railway embankments, slag heaps, garden walls. There were not many of them, not many at all. What happened next baffled the German commanders for days. The British opened fire, and within seconds the advancing German columns were being cut apart. Men dropped by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The survivors hit the ground and crawled for cover, convinced they had stumbled into a fortress defended by dozens of Maxim machine guns. The fire was relentless, accurate, and faster than anything the Germans had ever encountered from infantry rifles. Entire waves of soldiers were shredded before they could close within 400 yards of the British positions along the Mons-Condé Canal. The Germans regrouped, brought up artillery, and attacked again. Same result. More bodies in the Belgian mud. More officers screaming orders that nobody could follow because the men following those orders kept dying. So how did a force this small cause this much damage? How did an army that was barely a fraction of the size of Germany's fighting force manage to bloody the nose of the most feared military on the continent? To answer that, you have to go back to how Europe organized its armies at the turn of the 20th century, because that context explains everything. By 1914, every major nation in continental Europe built its military through conscription. France, Germany, Russia, Austria, Hungary. Every young man owed a period of mandatory military service, usually 2 or 3 years. After that, they went back to civilian life, but remained on the reserve rolls, available to be called up in wartime. This system created massive armies. Germany could mobilize over 4 million trained soldiers. France could field nearly 4 million of its own. Russia had even more, though many of them were poorly equipped. These were enormous forces built for enormous continental wars. Britain did not do this. Britain was an island nation with an empire that stretched across the globe, and the Royal Navy was its primary defense. The British Army existed mainly to garrison the empire, to keep order in India, to police colonial borders in Africa and the Middle East. There was no tradition of mass conscription. British soldiers were volunteers, career men. They signed up for 7 years of active service and 5 years in the reserve, and during those 7 active years, they trained constantly. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story. A German conscript might spend 2 years learning to be a soldier before going home to be a farmer or a factory worker. A British regular spent 7 years doing nothing except being a soldier. 7 years of drill, marching, and above all, shooting. Shooting until it was automatic. Shooting until the rifle was part of the body. The weapon they trained with was the short-magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III, one of the best bolt-action rifles ever designed. It held 10 rounds in its magazine, twice what the German Mauser carried. The bolt action was smooth, fast, and could be worked without taking the stock away from the shoulder. A trained man could keep his cheek welded to the stock, work the bolt with his right hand, and never lose sight of the target between shots. The rifle was designed for speed, and speed was exactly what the British Army demanded. The standard that defined British infantry at this time was called the Mad Minute. Every soldier was expected to fire at least 15 aimed rounds per minute at a target 300 yards away. 15 aimed shots in 60 seconds, not sprayed from the hip, not fired wildly in the general direction of the enemy, aimed, with the soldier working the bolt of his Lee-Enfield rifle, finding the target, and squeezing the trigger over and over, as fast as his hands could move. That was the minimum passing standard. Good soldiers exceeded it. The best marksmen could manage over 25 rounds in 60 seconds, and some pushed past 30. A sergeant instructor named Alfred Snoxall reportedly put 38 rounds into a 12-inch target at 300 yards in 1 minute during training at the School of Musketry in Hythe. 38 aimed hits in 60 seconds. That is not a human being firing a rifle. That is a machine. Now picture what that means on a battlefield. A single company of British infantry, roughly 250 men, each firing 15 to 20 aimed rounds per minute. That is somewhere between 3,700 and 5,000 accurate bullets hitting the enemy every 60 seconds from just one company. An entire battalion of 1,000 men could produce a volume of fire equivalent to dozens of machine guns. And unlike a machine gun, which is a fixed position and a high-priority target for enemy artillery, riflemen are spread across the landscape, dispersed, and nearly impossible to suppress with shelling. The Germans had never faced anything like it. Not in their training, not in their war games, not in any previous conflict. Their own infantry were competent, brave, well-equipped, but they were trained to a different standard. They relied on mass, on artillery superiority, and on the sheer momentum of their war plan. That war plan had a name, the Schlieffen Plan, named after Count Alfred von Schlieffen, the former chief of the German General Staff who had designed it before his death. The plan called for a massive, sweeping movement through Belgium and northern France, a giant right hook designed to encircle Paris and knock France out of the war within 6 weeks. Speed was everything. The German right wing had to move fast, crush whatever resistance it encountered, and swing south and west before the French could react. Once France fell, Germany could turn east and deal with Russia, which was expected to mobilize slowly. Standing directly in the path of that right hook, near a canal in a Belgian mining town, were 80,000 British professionals who could shoot faster and more accurately than any infantry force on Earth. The British Expeditionary Force, commanded by Field Marshal Sir John French, had crossed the English Channel in mid-August and concentrated around the town of Maubeuge in northeastern France. It consisted of just 2 corps. The 1st Corps under General Sir Douglas Haig and the 2nd Corps under General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien. 4 infantry divisions, 1 cavalry division, and supporting artillery. That was it. That was everything. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm reportedly called it a contemptible little army. Whether he actually said those words is debated to this day. But the British soldiers loved the insult. They adopted it with pride. They called themselves the Old Contemptibles for the rest of their lives. And those Old Contemptibles were about to prove just how wrong that label was. The Battle of Mons began on Sunday morning, August 23rd. The German First Army, under General Alexander von Kluck, had been advancing rapidly through Belgium, sweeping aside what remained of Belgian resistance. German intelligence had badly underestimated the British presence. Some German units did not even know the British had crossed the Channel. They expected nothing more than a thin screen of Belgian or French troops. Instead, they ran headlong into the men of the British 2nd Corps, dug in along the Mons-Condé Canal. The canal was about 60 feet wide, straight, and lined with industrial buildings, slag heaps, and workers' cottages. It was not ideal defensive terrain by any textbook standard, but the British soldiers made it work. They occupied the rooftops. They set up firing positions behind garden walls. They scraped shallow trenches where they could. And when the first German formations appeared on the northern bank and began advancing toward the bridges that crossed the canal, the British opened fire. The effect was devastating. German soldiers fell in rows. Officers leading from the front were picked off at ranges of 500 and 600 yards. Assault teams that tried to rush the canal bridges were cut down before they could cross. One German regiment, the 75th Infantry, lost 500 men in its first attack on the canal. 500 men gone against a force they had expected to brush aside without breaking stride. The fighting raged along the canal for hours. The Germans brought up artillery and began shelling the British positions, collapsing buildings and cratering the roads behind the canal. Under this bombardment, the British still held. When German infantry tried to exploit the artillery preparation and rush forward, they were met with the same wall of rifle fire. One German officer later wrote in his report that his men were convinced the British positions contained between 20 and 30 machine guns per battalion. The real number was 2. 2 Vickers machine guns per battalion. Everything else was Lee-Enfield rifles in the hands of men who had been trained to fire them faster than anyone thought possible. But Mons was never going to be a battle the British could win, not in any strategic sense. The problem was not what was in front of them. The problem was what was happening on either side. The French Fifth Army, which was supposed to be protecting the British right flank along the Sambre River, had been hit hard at the Battle of Charleroi on August 21st and was already pulling back. To the left, the Belgian army had retreated into the fortress city of Antwerp. The British position at Mons had become a salient, a bulge sticking forward into enemy territory with both flanks hanging in the air. If von Kluck swung around the sides, he could get behind the Beth and cut off their retreat entirely. Sir John French recognized the danger. By the evening of August 23rd, the order came down: withdraw, fall back to the south. And so began one of the most punishing ordeals in the history of the British Army. The retreat from Mons started in darkness on the night of August 23rd. The men had just fought an entire day's battle in sweltering August heat. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and now they had to turn their backs on the enemy and march south through the night. The roads behind them were choked with Belgian refugees pushing handcarts and wheelbarrows loaded with furniture and clothing. Horse-drawn supply wagons jammed every intersection. Units lost contact with each other in the confusion. Officers lost track of their companies. And the Germans did not let up. Von Kluck pushed his men forward relentlessly, pressing the British rearguard at every opportunity. German cavalry patrols probed the flanks, looking for gaps. German artillery shelled crossroads and bridges as the British tried to cross them. For 2 days, the British fell back through the French countryside, fighting rearguard actions at every village and crossroads. Sleep was a fantasy. Food was whatever you could grab from an orchard or beg from a French farmhouse as you stumbled past. Boots wore through on the cobblestone roads, and men wrapped their bleeding feet in rags torn from shirts and kept marching. Officers walked among their men, keeping them upright, keeping them moving, knowing that if the column stopped, some of the men would simply sit down and never get up again. The heat was brutal. August in northern France brought temperatures that turned the dusty roads into ovens. Men who had been carrying full packs, rifles, ammunition, and entrenching tools for days began dropping their equipment just to keep walking. Stragglers lined the ditches on both sides of every road, some sleeping, some just staring at nothing, too exhausted to care whether the Germans caught them. Then came Le Cateau, and one of the most controversial decisions of the entire campaign. On the morning of August 26th, Smith-Dorrien's Second Corps was in desperate shape. His men had been marching and fighting continuously for 3 days. They were stumbling with fatigue. German cavalry was on his flanks. More German infantry was closing in from the north and east. If he tried to continue the retreat without stopping, his exhausted units risked falling apart entirely, caught strung out on the roads by a force that outnumbered them by at least 2 to 1. Smith-Dorrien made a decision that directly contradicted his orders. Sir John French wanted everyone to keep retreating south. Smith-Dorrien decided his men could not retreat anymore, not right now. He chose to stop, turn around, and fight. The Battle of Le Cateau was the largest engagement the British Army had fought since the Duke of Wellington defeated Napoleon at Waterloo almost 100 years earlier. Roughly 40,000 British soldiers dug in across open rolling farmland south of the town and waited for the blow to fall. It came from nearly 140,000 Germans. The position was terrible by any military standard. Open ground, no prepared defenses. The Germans had superior numbers and far more artillery. This should have been a massacre, and for a while it looked like one. German shells tore through the British positions. Entire sections of trench were obliterated. Communication wires were cut immediately, leaving units unable to coordinate. But once again, the shooting skill of the British infantry defied every reasonable prediction. When German infantry advanced across the open fields, they walked into the same storm of rapid, aimed rifle fire they had encountered at Mons. And once again, they paid for every yard in blood. German formations that reached the 400-yard mark were cut to pieces. Formations that reached 200 yards simply ceased to exist. British gunners from the Royal Field Artillery fought with astonishing bravery. Several batteries fired their guns at point-blank range over open sights directly into advancing German infantry. Battery commanders stood in the open, directing fire while bullets kicked up dirt around their boots. When the situation became hopeless, some crews tried to haul their guns away by hand after their horses had been killed. Many did not make it. Guns were abandoned on the field. Crews were killed or captured alongside them. By the end of the day, on August 26th, the British had suffered nearly 8,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. Several battalions had been virtually destroyed. Artillery batteries had been overrun and lost. It was a savage toll for a single day's fighting, but Smith-Dorrien had achieved what he needed. The German advance had been disrupted for an entire day. The German commanders, stunned by the ferocity of the resistance, had paused to reorganize and bring up reinforcements. That pause allowed the rest of the BEF to continue falling back without being encircled. The gap that von Kluck needed to exploit had closed, at least for now. Whether Smith-Dorrien was right to fight at Cateau was debated for decades. Sir John French never forgave him, and eventually had him removed from command the following year. But many military historians argue that Cateau saved the BEF from total destruction. If Smith-Dorrien had tried to retreat with his exhausted, disintegrating corps, the Germans might have caught them in the open and annihilated them. What followed Cateau was the nightmare the survivors would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The Great Retreat lasted 13 days. From Mons to the outskirts of Paris, the British Expeditionary Force marched roughly 200 miles through the scorching heat of a French summer. Temperatures reached over 90 degrees Fahrenheit on the worst days. Men collapsed on the roads from heat exhaustion and dehydration. Soldiers fell asleep while marching and walked into ditches or stumbled into hedgerows. Some were so far gone with fatigue that they hallucinated. This is where the famous legend of the Angel of Mons was born. Exhausted British soldiers reported visions of ghostly bowmen from the Battle of Agincourt appearing in the sky above them, protecting them from the German advance. Newspapers back in England ran the stories. A short fiction piece by Arthur Machen, published in the London Evening News, was mistaken for a factual report and spread across the country. The Angel of Mons became one of the most famous myths of the First World War. The reality on the ground was nothing like a myth. It was blistered feet bleeding through worn-out boots, empty canteens, and cracked lips. The constant rumble of German artillery somewhere behind you. It was watching friends drop out of the marching column because they could not take another step, knowing the Germans would sweep them up within hours. It was rearguard companies turning to fight desperate holding actions at bridges and crossroads, dying to buy the rest of the army another hour of retreat. There were moments when the entire expedition teetered on the edge of catastrophe. Sir John French, shaken by the scale of the German forces and the losses at Mons and Cateau, seriously considered pulling the BEF out of the line entirely and retreating to the Channel ports for evacuation back to England. He had lost faith in the French army and did not believe the Allied cause could be saved. It took a personal intervention from Lord Kitchener, the British Secretary of State for War, to prevent a total withdrawal. Kitchener travelled to Paris and met with French on September 1st. He essentially ordered French to keep his army in the fight alongside the French forces. It was one of the most consequential meetings of the entire war. If Kitchener had not made that trip, the BEF might have sailed home and left France to fight alone. The French army was taking a beating of its own. Their initial war plan, the notorious Plan 17, had sent the bulk of French forces charging eastward into Alsace and Lorraine in frontal attacks against prepared German positions. The results were catastrophic. French soldiers in their bright red trousers and blue coats marched into fields swept by machine gun fire and modern artillery. The opening weeks of August 1914 cost France over 300,000 casualties. Entire regiments were gutted in single afternoons. But while the French and British were falling back, the German advance was developing problems that the men at the top had not anticipated. Von Kluck's First Army had been marching hard for weeks. His supply lines stretched across Belgium like a fraying rope. His horses, essential for hauling artillery and supplies, were dying from exhaustion and lack of fodder. His infantry were footsore, hungry, and increasingly ragged. Discipline held, but the men were reaching the end of their endurance, just like the British soldiers they were chasing. And then von Kluck made a decision that changed the entire course of the war. Instead of swinging wide to the west of Paris, as the Schlieffen plan required, he turned his army to the southeast. He wanted to pursue the retreating French Fifth Army and destroy it before it could reform. This meant passing to the east of Paris rather than encircling it from the west. Von Kluck's turn exposed the right flank of the entire German advance to the French garrison in Paris. French aerial reconnaissance pilots spotted the exposed flank from their observation aircraft, fragile wood and canvas biplanes circling above the marching German columns. General Joseph Gallieni, the military governor of Paris, saw the opportunity immediately and pushed for an immediate counterattack. On September 5th, he famously requisitioned 600 Parisian taxicabs to rush French reserve troops to the front. On September 6th, the French Sixth Army attacked von Kluck's exposed right flank along the Marne River east of Paris. Von Kluck had to pull troops away from his advance to deal with this new threat, pivoting his army northward to face the French attack. This opened a gap of nearly 30 miles between his First Army and the German Second Army under General Karl von Bülow to his left. And into that gap marched the battered, exhausted, barely functioning British Expeditionary Force. The BEF advanced into the opening between the two German armies on September 6th, threatening to split the entire German right wing in half. It was not a fast advance. The British soldiers were wrecked after 2 weeks of continuous combat and marching. They moved forward cautiously, half expecting a trap. Cavalry patrols from the 9th Lancers and the 18th Hussars pushed ahead through the gap, riding through abandoned German campfires and supply dumps, finding only scattered rearguard units where they had expected to meet the full weight of the German army. For the first time in 2 weeks, the British were moving forward instead of backward. The effect on morale was immediate. Men who had been staggering with exhaustion found energy they did not know they had left. The columns moved faster. Officers reported that the mood shifted from grim endurance to something resembling hope, but they moved forward, and that forward movement was enough. The German High Command panicked. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hensch, a staff officer sent from the Supreme Headquarters to assess the situation at the front, saw the gap and authorized a general withdrawal. The German armies pulled back to the high ground along the Aisne River and began digging in. The Schlieffen plan, the grand strategy that was supposed to knock France out of the war in 6 weeks, was dead. What followed was the race to the sea, as both sides attempted to outflank each other to the north. The front line extended, trench by trench, from the Swiss border to the Belgian coast. By November, the Western Front had solidified into the continuous trench system that would define the next 4 years of industrialized killing. And by November, the original British Expeditionary Force was essentially gone. The Old Contemptibles had been fed into a series of brutal battles through the autumn of 1914. The Battle of the Aisne in September, where the Germans dug in on the high ground north of the river, and the British discovered for the first time what trench warfare would look like. Then, the First Battle of Ypres in October and November, a desperate fight to hold the medieval Flemish city against repeated German assaults. At Ypres, the remnants of the original BEF held a salient against fresh German formations that included eager volunteer units filled with university students and young reservists. The fighting was savage. Battalions that had started the war with 1,000 men went into the line at Ypres with 300 and came out with fewer than 100. Dozens of smaller engagements filled the spaces between these major battles, each one grinding away at Britain's professional army with relentless efficiency. By Christmas 1914, the BEF had suffered over 90,000 casualties. When you consider that the original force was roughly 80,000, plus the reinforcements that trickled in through September and October, the mathematics become stark. The professional army that had sailed to France in August was virtually wiped out. The men who replaced them were different. They were Kitchener's volunteers, the enthusiastic civilians who had answered the famous recruiting poster with Lord Kitchener's mustachioed face, pointing directly at the viewer. They were brave. They were willing, they were patriotic, but they were not the trained professionals who could fire 15 aimed rounds per minute without thinking about it. That kind of expertise takes years to constant practice to build, and the men who carried it were lying in graves scattered across Belgium and northern France. The British Expeditionary Force of August 1914 was one of the finest small armies ever assembled, man for man. They were almost certainly the best trained infantry force on any battlefield in the world at that moment. Their rifle marksmanship caused the Germans to massively overestimate British strength at Mons, buying time that no one had thought available. Their endurance during the Great Retreat pushed the limits of what human bodies can tolerate. Their willingness to stand and fight at Cateau when the numbers said they should have been destroyed demonstrated a discipline that left a permanent impression on everyone who witnessed it, including the Germans. But here is the part that does not appear in the heroic retellings. The BEF's performance in August 1914 was magnificent, and it was also deeply tragic. Britain sent its best soldiers first, and the war consumed them in months. The army that emerged from the trenches in 1918 looked nothing like the army that had crossed the English Channel 4 years earlier. The Old Contemptibles became legends precisely because so few survived to grow old and tell their stories over pints in English pubs. Alexander von Kluck, the German general who had been on the receiving end of British rifle fire at Mons, later admitted that he had never encountered infantry with such shooting ability in his entire career. He had expected to push past the British in a single day. Instead, his army was delayed, bloodied, and forced to fight for every yard of ground. That delay mattered. Every hour, the BEF held at Mons. Every day, Smith-Dorrien bought at Cateau. Every mile of that grinding, miserable retreat south gave the French time to regroup, reassess, and prepare the counterattack at the Marne. If the British had not been there, if von Kluck's advance had gone unopposed for even 2 or 3 more days, the Schlieffen plan might have worked, Paris might have fallen. The war might have ended before the first trench was ever dug. That is what 80,000 men with Lee-Enfield rifles accomplished in August 1914. They did not win the war. Nobody was going to win that war in August. But they stopped it from being lost in the first month. They bought time with their blood, their broken feet, and their terrifyingly accurate shooting, and that time changed everything. The Kaiser called them contemptible. The Germans who faced them at the canal outside Mons, who watched their comrades fall in heaps before they could even identify where the fire was coming from, would have used a very different word. If this story gripped you, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us which moment from August 1914 hit you the hardest. We cover stories like this every week, and the next one might be even better.